Thanks for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm Mark Martin. Today, Israel taking the fight against Hamas to its headquarters in southern Gaza, with fierce battles against the terrorists on the ground and more reports of how Hamas abused female hostages. And as Americans have traveled to Israel to help the Jewish state during its time of crisis. Presidents of major universities here in the U.S. called to account by members of Congress for the surge in anti-Semitism on college campuses as Jewish students speak out about not feeling safe at their own school. And we're going to hear from an Israeli-American activist and author who's speaking out about the dangers of the growing anti-Semitic and anti-Israel sentiment and why she says it should be a wake-up call for the world. And the head of the FBI warning that the Israel-Hamas war is leading to increased terrorist threats here in the U.S. He's asking Congress to renew a controversial measure to fight future attacks. Those stories and more today on NewsWatch.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
We begin with Israel expanding its operation against Hamas, taking on the terrorists in Hamas's capital in southern Gaza, while also trying to protect civilians. Israeli troops are involved in fierce fighting on the ground, while the Air Force launching strikes as well. And as Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem, the U.S. believes the main part of the war may be over by January.
The IDF Chief of Staff says a new phase of the military campaign has begun.
In the last few days, we have moved to the third phase of the ground operations. We have secured many Hamas strongholds in the northern Gaza Strip, and now we are operating against its strongholds in the south.
Israeli forces are fighting now in Khan Yunis, the capital of Hamas in the southern Gaza Strip. The Biden administration reportedly expects the current phase to be over by January and warns Israel the window of time Israel has to finish the operation is closing. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu emphasizing that after the war, Gaza must be demilitarized and only the IDF can be trusted to do it.
No international force can be responsible for this. We've seen what happens in other places when international forces were brought for the goal of demilitarization. I'm not ready to close my eyes and accept any other arrangement.
Netanyahu also railed against the UN and others for not speaking up about the sexual violence by Hamas.
I say to the women's rights organizations, to the human rights organizations, you've heard of the rape of Israeli women? Horrible atrocities, sexual mutilation? I expect all civilized leaders, governments, nations to speak up against this atrocity.
Meanwhile, as the fighting between Israel and Hamas terrorists begins its third month, it's straining much of the country's economy. Given the number of military reservists supporting the fight, local farms are short on manpower.
I mean, a lot of the dads and the men have been called up for reserves and to go to fight in Gaza. And so that leaves this area, and yeah, there's no one to harvest, so it's a need that needs done. And yeah, we just wanted to help out with that.
That's where a group of American cowboys has stepped in, traveling to Israel on their own dime to help fill the gap.
Once I got the call, I dropped everything and headed right over.
The farmers here are suffering big time. So because we've worked in this area for 20 years, obviously we're not going to leave our farmers. We've got 120 farmers in this region that we've helped.
But the strain on Israel's economy is not only in its fields, but in the high-tech sector, finances, and trade.
And Chris is with us now from Jerusalem. Chris, let's talk about the latest phase of the fighting against Hamas in southern Gaza. How intense is it?
Well, Mark, actually, it's some of the most intense fighting in 2 months, if you can believe that. The Southern Command says it's most widespread and intensive. As we reported, they're striking Khan Yunis. That's the capital of southern Gaza, and this is the part of that third phase that the IDF Chief of Staff was talking about. It's suspected that Yahya Sinwar, he's the head of Hamas there in Gaza, could be somewhere near Khan Yunis. And still fierce fighting going on in northern Gaza. The IDF is saying many of the Hamas commanders and the battalions up there have been killed. And so far, the IDF estimates actually about 6,000 Hamas terrorists have died in the fighting.
You mentioned in your story, Chris, that the current phase of the fighting is expected to be over by January. What is the IDF expecting to happen then?
Well, the IDF is not giving a timetable of what's going to happen at the end of the war. And then what happens after that really goes back to what Benjamin Netanyahu said in our report. You know, they want the IDF to be the one that will enforce the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. And that's really a battle going on right now between the White House and the War Cabinet right now. Mark, you also get a sense that the intense fighting right now may be to speed up the end of the campaign. There's that diplomatic window that seems to be closing, and it perhaps is increasing the pace of the war. Israel almost always has a stopwatch in its wars, Mark, before the international pressure becomes too much. I mean, this has happened in almost all of its modern wars. 1967, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War. In 1973, the 1982 war in the First Lebanon War. And all of the conflicts with Hamas since 2007, it seems like Israel's not only waging its military campaign, but also looking at that diplomatic clock that is always ticking.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. The Biden administration keeps pressuring Israel, saying it has a limited time to finish the operation against Hamas. Does Israel feel that the Biden team is hamstringing the Israeli war on Hamas?
I think they feel that a lot. You may not see that or hear that publicly necessarily, but Antony Blinken was here just a few days ago. There was another White House delegation that's here now. And there's a sense, and you hear it from Israelis, Mark. You hear the fact that they say, you know, what's happening right now, the U.S. putting constraints on Israel is putting their own soldiers at risk. And we talked to our war correspondent, Chuck Colton, and he also said it's not only putting IDF soldiers at risk, but Palestinian lives at risk. So the White House seems to be micromanaging to a certain extent what's happening here in the military campaign, given their own political pressures that it's going on with the Democrat Party, the progressive wing, wanting a ceasefire. So the White House is balancing their own political machinations as well.
Changing focus now, have we learned more about Hamas's sexual abuse of the female hostages?
We're hearing right now, Mark, that at least 10 of the hostages, men and women, were sexually assaulted or abused while they're in captivity. There's an A report that came out citing a doctor who talked to many of these hostages that were released. And also there was widespread sexual abuse by Hamas terrorists during the October 7th onslaught. And we also heard that at a meeting at the Israeli War Cabinet. A group of recently freed hostages and family members met there. Some of the hostages saying they were being touched. And also we reported yesterday about the UN meeting where they were using rape as a weapon of war. And then anecdotally, Mark, I went to my dentist this morning, and he actually spent weeks trying to identify the remains from the October 7th massacre. He was describing the horrific ways these bodies were mutilated and why a dentist was called in, because sometimes the only way to identify these bodies was their teeth remains.
Wow, so disturbing, so sad. Hamas still holds around 138 hostages. Is that a hot political issue there in Israel still?
Yes, it is, Mark. Yeah, there was a tense meeting just yesterday between some of the released hostages and the family members that are still held in Gaza. A very tense meeting. We heard it was angry, voices raised, some people asking Netanyahu to resign. Netanyahu didn't directly engage with those demands, but he said, we're doing everything we can. And Hamas was giving them demands that even they wouldn't have accepted. So this is the balance that Netanyahu and the War Cabinet are going through, trying to balance, trying to get the hostages released and trying to prosecute the war and defeat Hamas.
Back to the fighting between Israeli forces and Hamas. Any new developments on the possibility of Israel flooding the Hamas tunnels in Gaza?
Well, we heard from the IDF Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi. He confirmed that report about the flooding the tunnels. He said it's a good idea. We're seeing a lot of underground infrastructure in Gaza, and this is one way they could destroy that. Whether or not it's going to harm some of the environment there remains to be seen, but it could be used to try to root out all these Hamas terrorists and destroy these tunnels.
All right. Thanks as always, Chris. And remember, many people are praying for you and our entire CBN News team in Jerusalem. Coming up, amid the Israel-Hamas war, the presidents of major universities called to account before Congress for growing complaints of anti-Semitism on their campuses. We're going to hear from an Israeli-American activist and author who's speaking out about the growing waves of anti-Semitism at these places of higher education and throughout the U.S. We're going to have those stories for you when we come back.
Download the CBN News app. One place for all of your news. Breaking news alerts. Watch CBN News Channel Live. CBN News. Because truth matters. Get the CBN News app today.
Anti-Semitism has spiked dramatically since the Hamas attacks of October 7th. It's been especially visible on college campuses. Now some are calling on Congress to act. Leaders from Ivy League schools testified Tuesday at the U.S. House, giving account as their universities face investigations over complaints of anti-Semitism. Washington correspondent Hillary Powell has that story.
On Capitol Hill, an urgent plea for protection on college campuses.
Well, on my way to class, I was greeted with chalk reading 90% of pigs are gas chambered. As a student, despite what my university says, I do not feel safe. Let me be clear, I do not feel safe.
I don't want to have to keep advocating for Jewish student safety on campus. It's not my job.
Students ask for help after surviving violent anti-Semitism on their campuses. Now, the presidents of MIT, Harvard, and the University of Pennsylvania had to answer for their schools' responses to an alarming surge in anti-Semitism.
I know some Israeli and Jewish students feel unsafe on campus. As they bear the horror of the Hamas attacks, we know there is further work to do.
Work like making sure the University of Pennsylvania educates on anti-Semitism.
We are in the midst of making certain that all anti-bigotry efforts ensure education about anti-Semitism.
I wonder if that type of education would have been in place at all of our college campuses before this, whether we would have seen the massive reactions that we have.
Harvard University President Claudine Gay was asked about an ongoing federal civil rights investigation about possible violations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. She declined to answer, but condemned anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism is a symptom of ignorance, and the cure for ignorance is knowledge. Harvard must model what it means to preserve free expression while combating prejudice.
The president says the campus is taking action with a task force to assist students targeted by doxing attempts. The university presidents say they'll also combat xenophobia and all forms of hate. One anti-Semitism expert says she's weary of the national complacency and says it's the third time she's testified about the danger.
Free speech does not permit harassment, discrimination, bias, threats, or violence in any form.
10 schools are currently under investigation by the Department of Education for possible discrimination based on shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics. Schools that violate Title VI can ultimately lose federal funding. The Department of Education isn't allowed to discuss current investigations, but will keep monitoring the results. In Washington, Hillary Powell, CBN News.
A key voice is speaking out against the resurgence of anti-Semitism spreading from college campuses to major cities to social media. CBN's Charlene Aaron recently spoke with Israeli-American activist Noa Tishby about her mission to spread truth and warn the West about the threat of anti-Israeli sentiment.
This well-known Israeli-American once served as her country's first envoy for combating anti-Semitism. While Noa Tishby no longer holds that official role, her advocacy for her homeland continues, especially after October 7th.
This time around, they not only did it in the worst of ways, beheading of babies in their cribs, the burning of entire families alive, the taking a pregnant woman and slushing her belly and pulling out the fetus and beheading the fetus.
Tishby is no stranger in the fight against anti-Jewish hatred, and that hatred has only risen since the Israel-Hamas war began. Following the October 7th Hamas attack, a significant spike in anti-Semitic incidents have been reported across the U.S. Cases of harassment, vandalism, and assault have jumped by almost 400%. Tishby recently told the Friends of the Israel Defense Forces that underlying messaging paved the way for the Hamas attack and the atmosphere that followed.
The grooming, ongoing grooming of Western civilization through universities, the media, and social media, so that when the time came and the Islamic Nazis carried out the act of genocide, many in the West would celebrate it, justify it, and no longer tell the difference between good and evil.
Pro-Palestinian protests have broken out worldwide on college campuses and in major cities. Protesters have gone as far as ripping down posters of Jewish hostages still held captive by Hamas.
It's just horrifying to me how American youth have been brainwashed so badly to think that tearing down a photo of a kidnapped child is God's work. It defies logic on so many levels. It's fine if you don't agree with Israeli policies. That's totally okay. You don't like the government. That's totally fine. What is your excuse when there's been an intent to kidnap a child or to rape a child or to murder or behead a baby?
In September, Tishby reached through renowned entertainment Variety magazine to write about the dangers of anti-Semitism masquerading as anti-Zionism, the movement for the self-determination and statehood of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland.
This obsessive hatred towards Israel is nothing but anti-Semitism in disguise. So when the Variety thing came out, I wrote an epilogue afterwards to just be like, I wrote this before this happened, and here it is upon us.
Tishby condemns the phrase "from the river to the sea," a rallying cry at many pro-Palestinian demonstrations.
The river is the Jordan River, the sea is the Mediterranean Sea, and from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, means ethnically cleansing the Jews from their ancestral land. There is no other meaning to it.
She also pushes back against those trying to equate October 7th with Israel's military campaign in Gaza, while also condemning the Hamas act of hiding behind innocent Palestinians.
Hamas have effectively turned Gaza into a terrorist base, and the entire city. Their intent is to use Palestinian people as human shields and get as many casualties as they possibly can while their leaders are hiding underground. The blood is on Hamas's hands.
Meanwhile, Tishby warns this entire moment should be seen as a wake-up call to other countries. Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Still ahead, a major warning from the head of the FBI. The Israel-Hamas war is leading to increased terrorist threats against the United States. He's asking Congress to renew a controversial measure to fight terrorists that some are concerned could also be used against Americans. We're going to bring you that story from Washington right after this. Warnings from the head of the FBI. The war between Israel and Hamas has increased the threat level to the U.S. with calls from terrorist organizations to attack America. And Christopher Wray also telling lawmakers his agency needs to renew an important surveillance tool by the end of the year, or the U.S. could face, quote, devastating consequences. That surveillance tool is Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. After 9/11, it provided a way to gather intelligence without a warrant on targeted foreigners outside of the United States. But the measure has become controversial. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka brings us the story.
What are we going to say to the family whose loved one's care was sabotaged when a hospital was taken offline by a foreign adversary and the FBI wasn't able to stop that cyber attack?
FBI Director Christopher Wray told Congress authorizing Section 702 of FISA was vital to national security.
What's the justification for not using every lawful tool to stop China from stealing our technology and undermining our freedoms? Because I can assure you, the PRC is not holding back.
Wray told the Senate Judiciary Committee that world events like the Israel-Hamas war have elevated the terrorist threat level, with calls from terrorist organizations to attack America and its citizens.
Blinking red lights analogy about 9/11. All the lights were blinking red before 9/11. Apparently, obviously, all of us missed it. Would you say that there's multiple blinking red lights out there?
I see blinking lights everywhere I turn.
The 702 program has come under fire over concerns about how it can be used. including the potential to spy on Americans.
There is a concern that the tools, including FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act 702, can be abused, and that it can be used to target U.S. citizens. Let me just ask you directly, is it possible to lawfully target an American citizen under Section 702?
Well, I think so-called reverse targeting, targeting of Americans through the end run of 702 is expressly prohibited.
Matt Gelka, CBN News.
There has been a bipartisan push to reform some of the powers in Section 702 over concerns it could be abused and used against U.S. citizens. Earlier this year, a court ruled the FBI broke its own rules when they used some of the 702 powers to search information related to the January 6th riots, as well as the racial protests from a few years ago. Wray said they've implemented changes at the FBI to make sure they are following the rules, and he stressed that watering down FISA to make it less effective could open the U.S. to terror attacks. Coming up, we're going to end on a lighter note as we introduce you to the word of the year for 2023, and it may be a term you haven't heard before. We'll have that story when we come back. Stay with us. Finally today, Oxford University Press has named the 2023 Word of the Year. But unless you're a member of Gen Z, you might have to Google it. The word is Riz, and if you think you haven't heard it before, it's actually the shortened form of the word charisma. Riz expresses a person's style, charm, or attractiveness. The contemporary word chosen by language experts, among other reasons, to show how internet culture increasingly shapes trends in our language today. Well, you'll have to ask someone if they know the word Riz today. And that's going to do it for this edition of CBN NewsWatch. Remember, you can find more of our news programs on the CBN News channel anytime or online with cbnnews.com. Also, tell us what you think about the stories you've seen by emailing newswatch@cbn.com. Or you can talk to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Hope you'll join us next time. Have a great day.